The Spanish looked at this island, spent exactly enough time to confirm there was no gold, and gave it the most dismissive name they could think of, the Useless Island. They sailed away and never came back. 4 centuries later, that same island is home to one of the most recognizable spirits on the global market, one of the most distinctive capital cities in the entire Caribbean, and a culture so layered and so specific that no other place on Earth can replicate it. This is Curaçao, and the Spanish got it spectacularly wrong. Curaçao sits just 65 kilometers off the northern coast of Venezuela, close enough to the South American mainland to see its outline on a clear day. It covers just over 400 square kilometers, which makes it small by almost any measure. What it is not, however, is ordinary. The landscape makes that clear immediately. This is not the lush, green Caribbean of travel brochures. The hills here are pale and dry, covered in giant cacti that stand like sentinels across the terrain, thorny shrubs that have adapted to survive on almost no rainfall, and divvy trees, permanently bent sideways by trade winds that have blown in the same direction for thousands of years. There is a stark, almost defiant beauty to it, a landscape that looks like it was never meant to be comfortable, yet has sustained human life for over 1,000 years. At the heart of the island is Willemstad, a capital city unlike any other in the Caribbean. St. Anna Bay cuts directly through its center, a channel of deep blue seawater that divides the city into 2 distinct sides. From above, ships from every corner of the world still glide through that channel daily, passing between 2 rows of narrow, brightly painted buildings that line the waterfront like something transported wholesale from Amsterdam and dropped into the tropics. To the east is Punda, the old quarter, where houses painted in turmeric yellow, coral pink, and mint green stand in neat rows, their facades reflected in the harbor water below. To the west is Otro Banda, quieter and darker, where murals cover the walls of older buildings and life moves at a pace that most visitors never slow down enough to notice. Connecting both sides is the Queen Emma Pontoon Bridge, a floating bridge that swings fully open whenever a large vessel needs to enter the harbor. When that happens, everyone crossing simply stops and waits. There is no frustration, no impatience. People watch the ship pass and then continue on their way, as though the interruption were as natural as a traffic light changing color. That patience, that easy relationship with interruption, is perhaps the first thing that tells you something important about how life is lived here. The Spanish saw a useless island. What they actually found was one of the finest deep-water harbors in the entire Caribbean, positioned at the intersection of some of the most important maritime routes between the Caribbean Sea and the South American coast. The Dutch noticed that detail. And from that single observation, everything that came next began. The weight of history, slavery, Tula, and the road to today history in Curaçao does not sit quietly in museums. It lives in the streets, in the architecture, in the language people speak every morning without thinking twice about where it came from. When the Dutch West India Company arrived in 1634, they saw immediately what the Spanish had dismissed. The deep natural harbor at Curaçao Bay could shelter large vessels safely. The island's position made it a natural waypoint for ships moving between Europe, the Caribbean, and the South American coast. Within years, they had built Willemstad from the ground up. Forts, docks, warehouses, and the infrastructure of a trading empire, turning a dry, overlooked rock into one of the most strategically valuable pieces of land in the Western Hemisphere. But the prosperity that followed carried a cost that the island is still reckoning with today. Curaçao became the largest slave trading hub operated by the Dutch West India Company in the Americas. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children were transported here from the African continent, not as the final destination, but as a processing point. They were held, assessed, and sold onward to plantations across the Caribbean and the American mainland. The scale of what happened here was not incidental. It was the engine of the island's early economy. Inside the Cura Hollanda Museum in Willemstad, That history is documented with unflinching precision. Iron shackles, written transaction records, surviving artifacts from the ships and the holding areas. The displays do not dramatize what happened. They do not need to. The objects speak with a clarity that no narration can improve upon. In 1795, a man named Tula decided that clarity was no longer enough. He organized and led one of the largest slave uprisings in the history of the Dutch Caribbean, gathering thousands of enslaved people in a coordinated demand for freedom. The uprising was ultimately suppressed by colonial authorities. Tula was captured and executed publicly, a deliberate act designed to extinguish what he had started. It did not work. Today, a monument to Tula stands facing the Caribbean Sea in Willemstad. It is not a triumphant statue. It is quiet, and it faces outward, toward a horizon he was never permitted to reach. Residents pass it daily. Some stop. Most simply acknowledge it without breaking stride, the way you acknowledge something that has always been there and always will be. The 20th century brought a different kind of transformation. When oil was discovered beneath the Venezuelan mainland, Curaçao's deep harbor made it the logical location for refining operations. The Royal Dutch Shell refinery arrived, and with it came workers from dozens of countries. Different languages, different traditions, different ways of cooking and worshiping and celebrating. They settled, integrated, and became Curaçaoan. That layering of histories, indigenous, Spanish, Dutch, African, Venezuelan, and everything that arrived with the oil industry, is not something Curaçao has neatly resolved or packaged into a single national narrative. It is still being processed, still being argued about, still showing up in conversations around dinner tables and in the lyrics of songs played at carnival, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about it. There is a word in Curaçao that does not translate cleanly into any other language, and that is precisely why it matters. Douchey. Depending on who says it, when, and to whom, it can mean sweetheart, delicious, beautiful, or simply, I am glad you are here. It is used as a greeting between neighbors, a term of affection between friends, a compliment offered to a stranger across a market stall. On an island where 4 languages, Papiamento, Dutch, Spanish, and English, move in and out of a single conversation without friction, douchey belongs to all of them, and none of them simultaneously. It is the word that sits underneath everything else, holding the social fabric of daily life together. That daily life begins before sunrise. As the eastern sky shifts from black to deep blue, wooden fishing boats from the Venezuelan coast begin appearing at the floating market along Willemstad's harbor. They arrive carrying whatever was harvested that morning: bananas, mangoes, avocados, coconuts, and produce that has traveled overnight across the water, separating the two countries. Within hours, those goods are arranged on small stalls lining the waterfront. Vendors call out in Spanish. Customers respond in Papiamento. Behind them, the pastel facades of the old quarter begin to glow as the Caribbean sun climbs higher and the city fully wakes. The smell of freshly made empanadas drifts through the streets early. Mango and papaya smoothies appear on counters before most offices have opened their doors. Students make their way to school. Fishermen return from the sea. Shopkeepers roll up their shutters. The pace is unhurried but purposeful, a rhythm that has been practiced on this island long enough to feel entirely natural. Architecture here shapes how people relate to one another in ways that are easy to overlook but impossible to unfeel once noticed. Many homes in Curaçao were built with wide front porches, large open doors, and yards that flow directly onto the street. The boundary between private life and community life was never drawn very firmly. Neighbors call out to each other across low fences without standing up. Conversations begin from the porch and continue into the afternoon without anyone deciding to start them. On higher ground beyond the city center, old Landhuizen, the grand plantation houses of an earlier era, sit with their wide arched corridors overlooking the valleys below. And just beneath them, the remnants of Castipali, Maishi, small structures built from palm trunks and clay, by laborers who constructed them not for beauty but for survival through the dry season. Those two types of buildings existed in the same landscape, separated by wealth and by history, and both still stand today as a reminder of how many different lives this small island has held simultaneously. By late afternoon, the energy shifts. Cafes in Otrobanda begin to fill. Children reappear in alleyways decorated with murals that have turned the older parts of the city into something between a neighborhood and an outdoor gallery. When the Queen Emma pontoon bridge swings open to allow a large ship through the harbor channel, the stream of pedestrians on both sides simply stops and watches. No one honks. No one checks their watch with visible frustration. The ship moves through. The bridge closes. People continue walking, as though the pause was always part of the plan. As night arrives, the Truckee Pan food trucks emerge. These roadside kitchens park in neighborhoods across the island, and within minutes they are surrounded. Families, groups of friends, workers finishing late shifts, visitors who stumbled upon them by accident, grilled meat, laughter, Caribbean music, and the particular ease of people who have nowhere more important to be. The trucks stay open until the last customer has eaten and the conversation has run its natural course. In Curaçao, the day does not end abruptly. It simply quiets, gradually, like a song that fades out rather than stops. The economy: lobster, laraja oranges, and lionfish for dinner. There is a fruit that grows on the dry hillsides of Curaçao that no one originally wanted. The laraja orange arrived on the island as a transplant, a sweet Valencia variety brought by Spanish settlers that the dry, rocky soil slowly transformed into something entirely different. The fruit that grew back was bitter, tough-skinned, and completely inedible raw. For generations, it was simply left on the trees, considered a failed experiment by an island that had already been written off once before. Then someone discovered that the dried peel, when processed correctly, produced an oil with a fragrance and flavor unlike anything available elsewhere in the world. That oil became the key ingredient in blue Curaçao liqueur, one of the most recognizable spirits on the global market, found behind bar counters from Tokyo to London to Sao Paulo. The fruit that was abandoned on arid hillsides now carries the island's name into every country on Earth. That pattern, finding extraordinary value in what others overlooked, runs through the entire economy of Curaçao like a thread. At first light, fishing boats leave Willemstad's harbor heading for open water. By late morning, the day's catch, tuna, red snapper, mahi-mahi, and Caribbean lobster, is already moving from the docks into local markets and restaurant kitchens. The harbor itself remains one of the busiest in the Caribbean, with cargo vessels and container ships arriving and departing daily. Maritime transport, logistics, and ship repair provide steady employment for a significant portion of the island's workforce. Tourism has become the largest single driver of the modern economy. Dive instructors, tour guides, hotel staff, taxi drivers, cafe owners in the historic district. Entire family livelihoods are built around the steady flow of visitors who arrive throughout the year, drawn by turquoise water, coral reefs, and a cultural distinctiveness that cannot be easily replicated anywhere else in the Caribbean. Beneath those reefs, however, a quiet battle is being fought. In recent years, the lionfish, a visually striking but devastatingly invasive species, has been spreading through Caribbean waters, feeding on the native marine life that coral reef ecosystems depend on. Local divers in Curaçao responded by picking up spears and going after them directly, descending onto the reefs to hunt the fish by hand. What they bring back to the surface does not go to waste. The lionfish are taken straight to restaurant kitchens across the island, cleaned, prepared, and served to diners that same evening. The visitors eating them rarely know the full story behind what is on their plate. They are eating a conservation effort. They are eating a problem being turned, with characteristic Curaçaoan pragmatism, into a solution. From the laraja orange fermenting on a dry hillside, to the lobster pulled from warm Caribbean water, to to the invasive fish that became a menu item. The economy of Curaçao has always been built on the same fundamental instinct. When the obvious resources are not there, you look harder. You find value where no one else thought to look. You make something from what you have, and you put your name on it. For an island once dismissed as having nothing worth keeping, that instinct has proven remarkably durable. Culture, language, and the table where everything meets. On an island this size, with a history this complicated, identity could easily have fractured into competing pieces. Instead, Curaçao did something more interesting. It blended. The most visible evidence of that blend is papiamento, the language that most Curaçaoans consider their own above any other. It is a Creole language, which means it was not invented by any single group or handed down from a single cultural source. It grew organically from the collision of Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and multiple West African languages, absorbing traces of the island's indigenous heritage along the way. The result is something that belongs entirely to the people who speak it, a language that carries the full weight of the island's history in every sentence without ever having to explain itself. For a long time, papiamento was treated as informal, as street language, as something that existed below the level of official life. Dutch remained the language of government, education, and formal institutions. That began to shift following the social unrest of 1969, when a labor movement that started at the Shell refinery grew into a broader reckoning about inequality, identity, and who the island actually belonged to. Papiamento emerged from those years with a new status, not just a language of the street, but a symbol of what Curaçao genuinely was beneath its colonial surface. Today, it is heard everywhere, in classrooms, in market negotiations, in music, in arguments between neighbors, in the lyrics of songs that spill out of open windows during Carnival. Carnival on this island is not a tourist event with a schedule and a viewing area. It is a full interruption of ordinary life. The streets of Willemstad fill with costumes that take months to construct, layers of color and mirror and featherwork that catch the light and throw it back in every direction. Tambour drums establish a rhythm that the entire city seems to reorganize itself around. The tumba, a musical style born on this island, keeps crowds moving through the heat for hours. Children line the sidewalks. Older residents lean out of windows above the street. The city breathes differently during Carnival, deeper and louder, and without apology. At the table, that same blending plays out in quieter but equally telling ways. Keshi Yena sits at the center of the Curaçaoan dining experience, a hollowed wheel of aged cheese filled with a savory mixture of meat, olives, capers, and spices, then baked until the cheese forms a golden crust around the filling. The dish carries the influence of the Dutch in its primary ingredient, and the African and South American culinary traditions in everything inside it. It is, in the most literal sense, a container built by one culture, holding the contents of several others. Beside it on the table might be funchi, a simple cornmeal staple that has fed people on this island for centuries, alongside traditional stews, fresh seafood, and a glass of bright blue Curaçao liqueur catching the light above the tablecloth. 4 languages might be spoken across a single family dinner. A grandmother addresses her grandchildren in papiamento. Someone switches to Spanish to include a Venezuelan neighbor who joined late. A younger cousin answers in Dutch out of habit from school. A visiting friend asks a question in English and receives answers in 3 languages simultaneously. Nobody finds this remarkable. It is simply how a meal sounds on this island. That easy movement between languages, between histories, between the European and the Caribbean and the African, without needing to resolve the tension between them into a single clean answer, is perhaps the most distinctly Curaçaoan thing of all. Other places choose an identity. Curaçao holds several at once, and has built something genuinely its own from the space between them. There are football pitches in Curaçao that were never officially built. They exist in the gaps between neighborhoods, stretches of flat concrete where two bags or backpacks placed on the ground at either end are enough to establish a goal. No painted lines, no nets, no stadium lights. Just children in the late afternoon sun, chasing a ball with the kind of focused intensity that does not require an audience to feel real. On an island of approximately 150,000 people, the national football team competes against nations with populations in the tens of millions, with professional academies, purpose-built training infrastructure, and decades of institutional investment in the sport. By any conventional measure, Curaçao should not be able to compete at the highest levels of international football. And yet, Eloy Room was born in Nijmegen, in the Netherlands. He came through the Dutch Youth Academy system and could have continued building his career there without ever looking back. In 2015, he made a different choice. He declared for Curaçao, the homeland of his father, and pulled on a blue shirt that most of the football world had never paid attention to. That decision mattered more than anyone could have predicted at the time. When Curaçao qualified for the World Cup, the island did not arrive quietly hoping to avoid embarrassment. They arrived as themselves, a small nation that had earned the right to be on that stage and intended to be present for every minute of it. Their opening match against Germany ended 7-1. By the numbers, it was a heavy defeat. But in the 67th minute of that match, Curaçao scored a single goal against one of the most decorated football nations in the history of the sport. In Willemstad, that moment landed like something much larger than a consolation strike. It was the moment the island's flag appeared, in a World Cup scoreline for the first time. The second match told a different story entirely. Against Ecuador, Curaçao held firm for 90 minutes. The final score was 0-0. For a nation of 150,000 people making its World Cup debut, a point earned against a South American football nation was not a minor result. Eloy Room stood between the posts for the full match, making save after save under sustained pressure. And when the final whistle blew, he had delivered something the island would not forget quickly. He had not simply kept a clean sheet. He had made Curaçao visible. Sport on the island extends well beyond football. The sea surrounds everything here, and that proximity shapes how people move and play from childhood. Swimming, diving, sailing, and water sports of every kind are woven into daily life in a way that is difficult to separate from ordinary recreation and impossible to separate from identity. Local divers who descend onto the reefs hunting lionfish will tell you that what they do is not entirely different from sport. It requires skill, precision, physical endurance, and an intimate knowledge of the underwater world. The fact that it also protects the coral reef ecosystem and ends with the catch on a restaurant menu the same evening is simply Curaçao being practical about everything at once. On this island, the line between sport, livelihood, and community has never been drawn very firmly. What matters is showing up, contributing what you have, and refusing to be defined by what you lack. For a nation that was once called useless, that refusal has become something close to a philosophy. The question Curaçao is still answering. Every island eventually reaches a version of the same crossroads, the moment when the things that made it distinctive, the pace of life, the architectural character of its streets, the informal rhythms of its daily routines, become the very things that outside forces want to consume, package, and sell back to it in a different form. Curaçao is standing at that crossroads right now, and the choices being made are not small ones. Every morning, cruise ships dock at Willemstad with a quiet efficiency that belies their scale. They are enormous vessels, and the passengers who step off them move through the historic district in steady streams, through the colorful streets of Punda, past the floating market, into the cafes and souvenir shops and dive centers that line the waterfront. For many families on the island, those footsteps represent direct income, a tour booked, a meal purchased, a taxi ride taken, a piece of jewelry chosen from a shop that has been in the same family for 2 generations. Tourism is not an abstraction here. It is the reason the lights stay on in a significant number of households, but the pressure that comes with it is equally concrete. The historic neighborhoods that visitors come specifically to experience are also the neighborhoods where people live. The coral reefs that draw divers from across the world are the same reefs being slowly stressed by warming water temperatures, increased boat traffic, and the cumulative pressure of a growing number of human beings moving through a fragile ecosystem year after year. On a small island, the feedback loop between what attracts people and what their presence damages is short and fast. Then there is the question that sits beneath all the others, the one that is hardest to answer directly. Curaçao is a constituent country of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Its residents hold Dutch passports. That document is not a minor detail. It is a door, one that opens onto an entirely different set of opportunities, more than 8,000 kilometers away. In European cities with larger labor markets, more developed infrastructure, and a standard of living that the island, for all its beauty and cultural richness, cannot always match. Young people who grow up here are aware of that door from an early age. Many walk through it. Some come back. Many do not. The island is not unaware of what this means over time. A place can sustain a certain rate of departure before the losses begin to compound, before the schools have fewer students, before the local businesses have fewer young workers, before the community events that define the culture begin to feel thinner at the edges. What Curaçao is working out, without a clean answer, and without the luxury of time, is how to remain itself while remaining connected to a world that will keep pulling at it from every direction. The turquoise water is still there. The divvy trees still lean in their permanent sideways angle under trade winds that have not changed direction in thousands of years. The Queen Emma Bridge still swings open for passing ships, and the people on both sides still wait without complaint. Douche is still said on street corners every morning, carrying everything it has always carried in a single word. But the island knows that none of those things preserve themselves automatically. They require a continuous, deliberate choice, made individually, made collectively, made every day, by people who understand what they have and what it costs to keep it. Curaçao was once dismissed by people who looked at it and saw nothing worth staying for. The island has spent 4 centuries proving them wrong. What happens next depends entirely on whether the people who call it home decide that it is still worth the same effort their ancestors put in. To look past what is obvious, to find the value in what others overlook, and to build something that carries the island's name into whatever comes after this. That question does not have an answer yet, but the fact that it is being asked at all is, in its own way, a sign that the island is paying attention. If this journey through Curaçao made you see the Caribbean differently, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss what we uncover next. Drop a comment below and tell us, would you visit Curaçao? And is there another hidden corner of the world you want us to explore? We read every single one, and your next suggestion might be our next destination.